Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to OnScript. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. I want to say a quick thanks to Jason Stark and Taylor Turzek who produce this podcast. Without their help, we'd be sunk. So we're so grateful for both of them. Also, if you're able to share the word about what we're doing here, I've given ideas for that in previous episodes, but you can also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And we hope you enjoy this episode.
Well, hello, OnScript listeners. Today, I have a special treat for you. I have Rabbi Shai Held, who is the president and dean of Hadar Institute in New York City. He has received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education, and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the most 50 prominent Jews in the world. How do you get on these lists? I need to know. I mean, I'll never be on one of these lists, but one can aspire, right?
By the end of this episode, I'll convert you, and then we'll get you on a list.
As long as we can get me on the list, I'm up for it. Rabbi Held is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, and the book we're going to be talking about today, Judaism is About Love. So I want to begin, Shai, if I can call you that,
please.
Reading from the very last page of the book. On page 385, you finish this book by telling a little story that I want to consider. And I'll just read you here. Quote, a midrash tells us that when the people gathered at Sinai, they stood as one person with one heart. How, asked Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, who was it possible for 600,000 people with a long history of conflict and combativeness to be of one heart? When they arrived at the mountain, he explains, they began to take care of one another's needs, concretely assisting others, in turn taught them to love one another, thus fulfilling and embodying the mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. For that brief moment, at least, the people achieved a foretaste of what the Torah demands and makes possible, a community centered on love and mutual care. And then you end with this sentence: we embrace the Torah, and it leads us into love. Now, I am fully convinced of your claims here, but I can imagine a lot of people, maybe from outside Judaism, that might not even have experience with midrashim or halakha or halachot. They would see Torah and love maybe in that classic Lutheran formula of gospel against law. How, in a word or two, can you convince us that the Torah leads us into love, or at least how you begin that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Drew, that you start with kind of the Lutheran formulation, because in many ways what I'm trying to do in this book is overcome that dichotomy, or show, maybe to put it more clearly, to show how alien that dichotomy is to a Jewish perspective, right? Law in Judaism is never an alternative to love. It's a manifestation of love. That is a kind of integral piece of Jewish liturgy. We say each morning, we thank God for God's vast love, which God expresses in no small part through giving us commandments. It's almost like the image I sometimes think about is a parent who's about to send their kid out into the world, and they say, before you go, I just want to impart some guidance for you. I want to give you some lessons about how to go through life. And I think a lot about the phrase in Deuteronomy, "L'tov lach," for your own good, which I think is not a threat, but rather more like so that you can flourish in this land that I'm about to give you. So it seems to me, that you have to, in order to understand Judaism on its own terms, which is what's so important to me in this book, in order to understand a kind of an internal Jewish logic, an internal Jewish spirituality, you have to put down the insistence that somehow love and law are in tension with each other. They're precisely not from a Jewish perspective. By the way, that's why the rabbis of the Talmud can talk about the idea of simcha shel mitzvah, the joy of being commanded, the deeply un-Lutheran formulation, but a deeply, deeply Jewish one.
Yeah, and I want to explore that more. And, at the outset, I want to say as somebody who's worked a little bit in the Jewish world, this probably is the most Christian-friendly introduction to modern Jewish thought, at least Rabbi Shai Held's modern Jewish thought, because you are making some proposals here, but you're collecting a lot of proposals as well and forming them together in one giant proposal. And I think for people who maybe struggle to hear what you said about the joy of commandment, that this might be the most accessible text to get you into that frame of mind. I would also say personally, just at the outset, if I can just give my own opinion, I think every Christian should believe what you just said about the joy of being commanded as well. And then I think you do a good job later of showing how this is kind of what Jesus seems to be after in various spots of his teaching.
I would say,
go
Drew,
ahead,
if I
please.
could, I'll just observe. It's a funny thing to begin a podcast about my book by talking about criticisms of my book. But I will say that the most interesting feedback in some ways that I've gotten from Christian thinkers, and as I think I've been in conversation with a lot of Christian thinkers about this book since it came out, is I had a Catholic ethicist, Steve Pope, say to me, it's interesting that your Shai's default portrayal of Christianity feels very Lutheran. And he said, sometimes when you describe a Jewish-Christian tension, I'm tempted to say, I, Steve Pope, a Catholic, am on the Jewish side of this dichotomy. When you talk about law as a manifestation of love, I'm like, yes, of course. And then recently another friend, Richard Middleton, who probably has been on this podcast,
Right.
said to me, as a Wesleyan, I don't love these Lutheran descriptions of Christianity that you sometimes are prone to. I don't hear Wesley in that. I hear myself on the Jewish side of this, which I found just incredibly interesting. And,
Yeah.
It happens to be that in my own study of Christianity, I started many, many years ago with Augustine and Luther. And what Steve Pope has said to me is, yeah, if you had dived into Aquinas first, your portrayal of Christianity might sound a little different, which I found just really, really interesting.
Yeah, and quite honestly, 50 years ago, you wouldn't have had as many Christians coming to you saying those words as well. I think there's been some recent
Right.
scholarship and movement in that direction as well for the good. I want to talk a little bit about method. Speaking of Jewish thinking and Jewish studies, how do you assess the views of the sages in Jewish history in forming your own view of love that you espouse in this book? And maybe I can ask you also alongside that, how powerful are halakha and Jewish ritual in forming our love, in your view?
So if I understood the first part of your question correctly, I would say that I'm always doing sort of two things simultaneously. I hope smoothly, although I'm sure not always so smoothly, which is both reading the text with the tradition of its interpretation, and then also reading modern academic scholarship, kind of trying to access different types of shot that might not have always been so available. And, my ideal is to integrate those two things, ideally seamlessly, but of course that's not always possible. So, to go back for a minute to where you started, one of the texts that has been most sort of formative for me is a kind of a comment that appears in the Talmud in Tractate Sotah that actually sort of, I think some people probably are tempted to dismiss as a throwaway, but that kind of has always landed very deep for me. And that is where the sages say, the beginning of Torah is loving kindness and the end of Torah is loving kindness. The beginning of Torah is loving kindness, they say, and they illustrate that through God, creating belts or garments for Adam and Eve. And the end of Torah is loving kindness, they say, because God buries Moses in the valley. Now, there's a kind of tone-deaf reading of that, I think, which would say, oh, okay, they're saying that at the beginning of Torah there's love, and at the end of Torah there's love. But when you say that the beginning and end of X is Y, I think what you're really saying on some level is that X exists in the world to manifest Y, to bring out Y. And so when the sages say the beginning and end of Torah is loving kindness, they are, I think, providing, I experience them as offering a kind of hermeneutic, a kind of hermeneutical principle, if you will. Read this for the sake of love. Read this with an eye towards how it can build communities of love, and read this with a knowledge that the God who is behind this is a God of love. That is amplified even more in a midrash in Ecclesiastes Rabbah. The formulation is, the beginning of Torah is loving kindness, the middle of Torah is loving kindness, and the end of Torah is loving kindness. I think they're making a very grand claim there. And that's the claim that sort of animates me. That's a rabbinic claim. It's a rabbinic way of reading the Bible. Now, I'm not invested at all in sort of thereby smoothing over or pretending that there are no rough edges, right? I often say this to people, part of what it means to live with a tradition, I think, is to live with its ragged, jagged edges. It's not to make everything whole and everything work. There are texts that, as someone who believes in a God of love, I'm brought up. I mean, what? How could God possibly say this? So again, I don't. There is, of course, some degree of apologetics in any theology, but I'm not an apologist in the sense that I want to readily acknowledge that there are texts that I don't know what to do with. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and I think it leads me to the next part of the question, which is, how does the Jewish tradition of rituals, separating that out from the actual rituals of the Torah, but the Jewish appropriation of the Torah's rituals, how do those instantiate, frame, embody, teach love to the Jewish people who practice those, at least?
Yeah, interesting. So let me give maybe a couple of examples that come to mind when you first asked that question. One, a relatively recent modern ritual, meaning stemming from, I think, the 17th century, but very widespread, is the practice of opening our eyes in the morning and having the first word we say be grateful. Moda'ani or moda'ani lefanecha, grateful am I before you. And I had spent a lot of time thinking about what it would mean for my life if I said that with my heart every morning and not just with my lips, right? Now, if you stand inside an orientation of being grateful before God as the centering practice that kind of begins your day, I mean, I think that is all about being oriented towards a certain kind of gratitude, which I argue in the book is kind of inextricably linked with generosity. You can't be grateful without also wanting others to have what you do. So, that's one very kind of simple example. And since we're recording this, just as the holiday of Sukkot is about to start, I will mention that there's a midrash that I really, really love, talking about Shmini Atzeret, the last day of Sukkot, if you will, where the rabbis, Shmini Atzeret has no rituals, right? It's just you go to synagogue, you pray, you have meals. There's no unique rituals to it. And the rabbis imagine God saying to the Jewish people, we've been together a lot this past month, Rosh Hashanah, Yom
Right,
Kippur,
right.
Sukkot. Stay with me one more day before you leave. I find the pathos of that just incredibly moving. It's like they just imagine a God who wants intimacy. That's all God wants. God wants to be close to people. And obviously, I don't experience that every moment of my life. Would that I have experienced it more often than I do. But I think that as a kind of ritual, paradoxically, this kind of like very stripped down ritual is very, very powerful. Now, in a different register, I'll just mention that there's also a whole bunch of rituals, I think, that are meant to instill in us like a deep consciousness and awareness of the needs of the most vulnerable members of a community. Now, this is not always observed, but I'll just give you one example. Now, jumping to the Middle Ages, Maimonides is very emphatic that when you have meals to celebrate the holidays, the festivals, you must invite the poorest members of the community to your table, or else you are experiencing, he puts it, not the joy of the festival, but the joy of your own belly. And I think about that sort of a lot, about like what would a kind of consciousness that says, and that's related to gratitude is open-hearted. Genuine gratitude is open-hearted. So if I'm celebrating the joy of living in covenant with God, I have to open my heart to people who don't have what God intends them to.
Okay, so I want to push this line just one more step and say, thinking about ritual, and maybe here we can think more about primary ritual from the Torah, the commanded ritual that we must practice, right? Versus love. There have been movements in scholarship to say that the prophets, they innovate. Even a good friend of mine, Jerry Ungerman, has argued that that what the prophets innovated was that, or what they revealed was that morality kind of overtakes ritual. That when it comes down to it, the morality of the individual is more important than the ritual. Um, I disagree with that a little bit, but for really nerdy reasons. But I wonder if there's a way in which you could say love overtakes ritual in some way, or can you not have love without ritual in the Jewish tradition, the commanded ones?
Right. So it's the statement "love overtakes ritual" feels like a deeply non-Jewish formulation to
Yeah.
me, right? That the Jewish challenge, it feels to me, is always to find a way to make sure that the ritual is an expression of love rather than a kind of bypassing of it. And the danger, as the prophets, as you rightly note, point out, is that it's easy for ritual to kind of be a distraction from the reality of human suffering and the needs of human community rather than a path towards it. I don't love the formulation or the notion that love overtakes ritual, but I do think the question of how ritual can spill over into life, right? In other words, if let's imagine the kind of anthropological notion that ritual provides us an alternative world to live in. So I think, in Judaism, the really dramatic expression of that is the traditional practice of Shabbat, which we imagine is sort of living in the present, in the future, what Jews call a foretaste of the world to come, me'ein olam haba. So on one level, it feels to me that the spiritual challenge is, okay, how do I make Shabbat feel more or, be experienced more as a kind of foretaste of the world to come? But then the second challenge is, how do I let my experience of Shabbat spill over into my experience of Tuesday and Wednesday afternoon? Right? How am I changed when I leave the ritual world and go back into the quotidian world? That is like a really profound question. I don't think we ask it enough. I'm not sure anyone really asks it enough in any religious community, probably because we're all a little scared of that question. Well, what if I can't? What if I feel that I don't? What if I'm forced to come face to face with the ways that, spiritually, I don't know how much I'm growing a lot of the time. But that to me is really this kind of two-step question, how to make Shabbat feel more like Shabbat, but then in a funny way, how to make Tuesday feel like it has elements of Shabbat in it as well.
Yeah, so if I can reframe what I think you just did there, is you basically said, no, ritual and love actually are meant to go together, maybe like ebony and ivory on the piano. And when you heard someone trying to tease those apart in too unnatural of a way, your first instinct was to say, how can we work harder to put them back together, or to make love be an expression of the ritual, the ritual being funded by love and extending love out into the world beyond the ritual itself?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do, because that feels to me like what traditional Jewish spirituality is always aspiring to do. I mean, in a way, it depends what hat I'm wearing. If you ask me to be a kind of social critic, I can talk about a million ways that I feel like my community and other communities fall short of this. But if you ask me as a kind of interpreter of tradition, as a theologian, if you will, right, then my impulse is always going to be to do the traditional thing about weaving the two back together. And when I see the seams, not to pull them further apart, but in fact, to try to weave them back together.
Hmm. You begin the book with a chapter titled "We Are Loved," which some people would interpret as a divine passive. We are loved by God subtitle. But it seems like the notion of our age is love thyself. We've gripped onto until that kind of Freudian, until you know yourself and love thyself, which obviously has deep roots in some Hellenistic thought. You can't do anything. So I wonder why you began with not love thyself, but knowing that you are loved, or we are loved, actually, more importantly.
Yeah, I think this is a really important and actually quite a profound question. Um, I wanted to begin with a sense of human beings come second. As important as we are, we come second. God comes first. And that's both a theological claim and a spiritual, and for me, even I would say an ethical one. I don't want to start with love yourself, because although I do think that there are very important aspects of that, I also was wary of falling into the kind of narcissism of a lot of American spirituality, you know, reducing the venerable tradition of yoga to give yourself a gift, right? I just find some of that language kind of nauseating. I understand where it comes from. I really appreciate what it's reacting against, and yet I don't like it. Now, I think if I were to be really honest and you were to push me harder, I would say that I also did make a concession to the reality of American secularity and, to be honest, the secularity or discomfort with theological language among many American Jews. My last chapter, or my last section, is about who God is. I found myself over and over again reflecting as I was working on the book, if I were really just writing this book from an internal Jewish logic, that section would come first. But if I'm trying to pull the American reader, and particularly the American Jewish reader, into this discourse, I can't start there. I have to start, if you will, anthropologically. But if I'm going to start anthropologically, I want to start with the irreducibly theological dimension of a Jewish anthropology. I don't know, that was a very kind of pretentious way of saying it, so I hope it's clear what I mean. I felt I needed to start with human experience, but it was important to me, if I was going to make that concession, to start with the human experience of something that comes before the human, of being loved already by God. When I say we are loved, I very much mean we are loved by God. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, the Mishnah says, right? Beloved is the human being who was created in the image of God. We are always already loved by God. To use, language that is resonant for many Christians, and I think lies at the heart of Jewish spirituality, is love is grace, right? We are graced with love. We are loved just by dint of having been created in God's image. So it's a kind of dialectical dance I was doing there.
Yeah. Well, and I think that pattern kind of is evinced throughout the book. I think it's fair to say that you're doing very deep dives across the book into the theology of love, and through the tradition and through the text, the scriptural text, even Christian scripture as well. You're bringing it in where you see conversation partners. But I have to tell those of you who have not yet read this book that it might be the most deceptively readable book in theology I've read in a long time, where you can read along for dozens of pages and not kind of have been fully aware how much you've actually been engaged theologically, because if you have a certain way of doing theology, this does not read like that. It doesn't make it any less incisive, though, or didn't for me, and certainly didn't make it any less controversial for me. Certain parts where I had to stop and go, wait, what? And then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna read on and see what he does with this, right? And it was always an interesting turn. So speaking of deep dives, you studied under John Levinson at Harvard and worked alongside him as well, as you were telling me off air, stories that we can't repeat publicly. I'm wondering how you see this project as different in any ways, or being having deep affinity with what John Levinson did with love in his book, which I think we have an interview with him on OnScript from years ago.
Yeah, it's a hard question, and by the way, it's a hard question a little bit because his book on love is not so fresh in my mind at the moment. But let me try to say a couple things about this. One is that I think that John and I are engaged in parallel but somewhat different projects, in that at the end of the day, John is writing scholarship for scholars with the hopes that non-scholars will kind of overhear and internalize some of what he's arguing. I think he would accept that description. I am writing, quote unquote, for regular people with the hopes that scholars will listen in and overhear. Like, I've made a decision to write, and it goes back to what you just said. I'm writing in a very different register than a lot of academics write, partially because that's just sort of the way I think, but partially because I have certain models of writing scholarly things in ways that smart, thoughtful people who are not full-time professional scholars can read, internalize, and grapple with. So we talk, I think, in different registers because the primary audience we have in mind as we write, I think, is different. I think it's just worth sort of starting out by noting that. I think I would also say that, and maybe this is a little bit kind of inside baseball-y, but My reading of the love commands in the Torah are more shaped by recent ar- arguments. For example, Jacqueline Lapsley's argument about the kind of irreducibly emotional dimensions of love that is commanded, whereas John is, I think, more in the tradition of Moran and this notion that love is not exclusively but primarily about obedience. My, Another way of saying that is, I think my reading of love in the Torah is more robustly emotional than John's, um, which might tell you something about our different temperaments and personalities, and might just tell you something about different kind of inclinations here. I was surprised, honestly, reading John's book, that Lapsley's argument had not seemed to land as deeply with him as I would have expected. And I don't know, actually, I've never had this conversation with him, whether he doesn't accept it, whether he thinks she overstates her point. I'm not really sure. But that's, I think, a kind of integral difference. Also, although in that book, John does talk about post-biblical, even post-rabbinic Judaism. As I recall, he talks about Bachya ibn Pakuda and later Jewish thinkers. I am doing a more, I would say, kind of synchronic reading of the Jewish tradition as a whole than he, as a biblical scholar, would feel comfortable with, or at least would feel inclined to, right? So I have no issue moving from, I don't know, Rabbi Chaim Shmulevich, who you mentioned at the outset, a 20th century Musar teacher, and the book of Deuteronomy, because that's the project I'm engaged in. I could imagine a certain kind of historically minded reader finding my book making them completely crazy, right? Well, you can't do that. Well, actually, yes, I can, because I'm doing something different than you are, right? I'm actually kind of laying out the tradition in front of me and then telling the story using the various elements. I feel incredibly indebted to and have learned immense amounts from kind of more historical, critical approaches to the various texts that I work with. But that's not what I'm up to in a book like this.
Hmm. That's very helpful. And I think I'm finding myself more attracted to people who are writing in your tone for scholars, like you said. I think it would surprise most people to think like somebody who's writing for a popular level book. I will point out it's a 400-page popular level book, so it's
With
not
150 pages of footnotes.
with
right?
150 pages. You could beat your children with this book. It's heavy enough. At least a small child. I don't know about a teenager. Um, so um, So it's an interesting project because honestly, I saw Judaism as about love, and unless Richard Middleton hadn't emailed me directly and said you have to read this book, that might have been one that kind of went past my radar. The old it's all about God is love, whatever. I've heard that one before, right? And then the first few pages I'm reading, just going, okay, I trust Richard. He's going to go, and then all of a sudden I realize, okay, this guy is actually doing something, some quite serious thinking here.
Right.
Go ahead.
Drew, if I could just comment on what you said, I, I, I want to observe, when I said earlier that my reading is sort of more emotional than John's, I don't mean that it's meant to be sentimental or sentimentalized,
Right.
right? I tell you, the most profound thing any reader of mine has ever said to me about what I'm trying to do, and I hope this doesn't sound grandiose, I just actually found it really helpful, is Eric Alterman, who some readers might be familiar with as a journalist. Eric, after attending a series of lectures of mine and reading my book on Heschel, said, you're trying to do something very hard. You're asking people to feel very deeply and think very deeply at the very same time. That is a very hard thing to pull off. And I said to him, that is exactly right. That is always what I'm groping for. Can I say something that is philosophically sophisticated and humanly enriching at the same time? That's what I certainly don't always succeed at it. And not every paragraph does that, of course. But that's the kind of the aspiration, if you will, that I have as a writer, as a teacher.
Yeah, no, I think we need more of this in academia specifically. So good job. You captivated me,
Thank you.
which is hard to do. I think, there is a general cultural call to be loving. And I think, just if you think about the intellectual history of the call to be a loving person, certainly goes on a steep incline during the 1960s and the peace movement, this kind of call to love and love others. but it's not a well-funded call to love. It's kind of has no real object, or it has no grounding. It's just kind of like, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. Be good to one another,
Mhm.
So I wonder what you think of the dangers and that kind of demand that everybody be loving, but no actual basis or motivation for it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, although I'll note that you just knocked George Carlin, which I have hesitations about doing.
No, look, George Carlin's got his own problems, but
Exactly.
but
Um,
he was great in that movie.
yes, indeed. So, if I'm understanding what you're getting at correctly, let me try to address it in two ways. One is that the idea of love as commandment is very important to me, as opposed to merely love as impulse. I do think love as impulse is really important because this is something I actually had written for the book and then taken out a kind of long discussion about love as a virtue in Jewish thought. I do think that kind of from a virtue ethics perspective, love as an impulse is really important. But and, you know, from a perspective of a kind of a biblically based theology and spirituality, the notion that love is something I am summoned to by God. It is kind of written into the, if you will, the DNA of my existence. I don't mean that literally, but right. It is written into the DNA of my existence that I am a being who is summoned to love. I am created for the purpose of love. Um, it's hard to reduce that, I think, to kind of like sentimental, hallmarky. I actually think it's like a really profound challenge at the core of our being. Um, I've thought over the years about what it would look like to try to write a theological anthropology centered on love, a fully developed kind of theological anthropology centered on the both the commandment and the impulse to love. And also, at the other end, the tradition is very emphatic about who are some of the core recipients, if you will, of my love. It's not just like be good to one another. First of all, I mean, yes, it is certainly, love your neighbor, which is a very tall order, but also in ways that I find really kind of interesting and challenging in all kinds of formulations, love the vulnerable. Deuteronomy chapter 10, um, just as God loves the stranger, so should you love the stranger. The God who loves widows and orphans. What it means to take that seriously, to take that on board intellectually, spiritually, morally, that is very demanding stuff. That is not just kind of, easily reducible to cliche. It's very hard to live up to, I should say, of course. But I mean, I think about this a lot, a mandate to love the stranger. That's enough to spend your life trying to figure out if you've ever lived up to that in any way. I'll just sort of observe that the stranger is the only person in Deuteronomy who we are commanded to love. If you just read Deuteronomy alone, we're commanded to love God and love the stranger. Stranger really matters here. Um, and that doesn't feel like very generic to me. It
Right.
feels quite, demanding in concrete ways.
And we'll come back to those in a little while. First, I want to break it up and do a speed round here. So I hope you're ready. We're
Oh
actually
boy,
going to
here we
play a
go.
game here in a little bit. So,
Okay, sounds good.
So Judaism is about love, but food-wise, Judaism is about blank.
God help me, I don't know where this came from. The first word that came to mind was knishes.
I literally thought you were going to say knish as soon as you said the first word that came to mind.
I don't remember the last time I had a knish, and yet somehow,
I
Drew,
don't know if I've ever had a knish. Okay.
you and I will go to the Lower East Side and eat knishes and Gus's pickles. It'll be a great time.
All right. I cannot wait. Excellent. Whose work from the last 50 years has been the most influential in your thinking? So a contemporary scholar.
Wow. I'll start with a Christian because I happened to be emailing with him yesterday, and he's had a big impact on my thinking. Miroslav Volf. One of the things I know this is I'm totally defying the rules of a speed round, but one of the things that Miroslav and I have talked about a little bit, trying to understand, is how it is that he, as a Christian theologian, and I, as a Jewish one, end up making arguments about texts that are often almost identical with each other, and sort of
Right.
why that might be and where that comes from. So Miroslav's work has been on my mind a lot. Sorry, I'll try to answer briefly. I am Jewish, so it's hard for me to do that, but I'll try.
That's good. We can handle the thinking behind the answer as well. Do you like Jewish jokes.
Does any Jew not like Jewish jokes?
Okay. So not about Jews, but like Jewish from within Judaism. Okay, so I'm going to start the joke and I'm going to see if you can finish it, right?
Wow. Good
so
stuff.
I think this will be an easy one though. Okay. Did you hear about the Jewish man that gets stranded on a deserted island? Do you know this one?
No.
And years later, he gets rescued and his rescuers show up and he's built 3 buildings. You do know this one?
I assume one is the synagogue he goes to, one
Yeah.
is a synagogue he doesn't go to, and one is a synagogue he would never go to.
That's right. That's exactly right. So you do, yeah. There is also a Scottish Presbyterian version. There's probably lots of different versions of that joke, but
You make me want to tell you my favorite Jewish joke in
yes,
the world.
please do.
Can I tell
Please
my
do.
favorite
Yeah.
Jewish joke in the world? These 2 Jews are walking past each other, 2 old guys. One guy says to the other, "Hyman, it's so good to see you. How are you?" Hyman says, "In 1 word, good. In 2 words, not good."
I do love that. I appreciate
That is basically Jewish humor in a nutshell.
No, it hits deep. It's a deep cut. Okay. Most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years for you?
Whoa. Well, this is not the answer to that question, but the book that most pulled me into biblical studies, John Levinson's Creation and the Persistence of Evil.
Okay, well, that's an important biblical book.
It's a very important work. I'm just,
Yeah.
I in 1 second, I'm not prepared to make that grand a claim, but I would say most formative for me.
Okay, excellent. Now we're going to play, as far as I know, this is the first ever game that has been played in the speed round for OnScript over, 7, 8 years we've been going.
Love it. I'm honored.
Okay, so the game is simply this. We're going to go back and forth ping pong style, naming songs with love in the title.
Great. Love is all you need.
Okay, there you go. You got your first one. So what's love got to do with it?
Oh my God. How am I going to blank? This is hilarious. I love you just the way you are.
Oh, excellent. I was just playing that on guitar last night. That's crazy. Power of Love, Huey Lewis and the News.
Ooh, good song. Please Forgive Me, Bryan Adams. Can't Stop Loving You.
Wow. Okay. I Just Called to Say I Love You.
I Can't Help Falling in Love with You.
I Want to Know What Love Is.
Love Is by the late Andy Gibb.
Oh, okay. Bee Gees. Love Will Keep Us Together. That could have been the title of your book.
Exactly. I Just Call to Say I Love You.
Okay. Love Yourself, Bieber.
Oh, wow. That's like way after my time.
Yeah.
I don't know. Now I feel like I should come up with a Taylor Swift song, but I don't really know any Taylor Swift songs.
Yeah, I don't think I could pull a Taylor.
How can I possibly be stuck? Love Is Like a Rock. You know that song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Excellent. Crazy Little Thing Called Love.
Now you prepared, Drew.
Yeah. I have a whole list
fair.
here.
This is totally. This is not fair. Now I'm trying to go through the Bee Gees catalog.
I'm very impressed. I have a written list of songs, and you're actually pulling from your own memory.
Ooh, I'm all out of love. I'm
so
lost without you.
Oh yeah. Okay. Excellent. I Will Always Love You, Dolly Parton's version, of course.
Of course, we wouldn't quote Whitney Houston. What about Islands in the Stream? Isn't that about love? Speaking of Dolly Parton,
It probably is about Islands in the Stream.
That is what we are. No one in between. I don't know. Is there love in that song? I mean, it's about love. Can I cheat? And
we'll go with it. I'm gonna end this unless you got one more. To Sir with Love, an old one, which I still don't even know what that means. To Sir with Love, but I know it was a movie, right? The Sidney Poitier movie.
Exactly. Wow, that was one of those moments where pressure begins to cloud out your brain. I couldn't think
I don't know. I think you did pretty well. You were pulling them. So, and again, I was literally reading from a list. So, hard question. Does God have a special love for the Jewish people? Or particular love, maybe I could say.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I want to sort of frame this by saying, I think there are many Jewish thinkers in modern times who have really struggled with and at times even repudiated that notion. As you may know, Mordechai Kaplan, for example, prominent American Jewish thinker and leader, really wanted with great passion to reject the notion of chosenness, which he found kind of irreducibly triumphalist and self-congratulatory. I start from the assumption that it seems to me the tradition kind of unravels if you just say, I'm rejecting one of its most foundational claims. So what I try to do in this book is something else, which is to say, can we develop a theology of divine chosenness, of God's love for Israel, that is robustly traditional and yet careful to weed out kind of potentially destructive manifestations of that theology? So I would say, yes, God does love Israel with a unique love. And it's important to say, for example, as Patrick Miller, the Bible scholar, has pointed out, Deuteronomy goes out of its way to make clear that doesn't mean that God's love for Israel is exclusive. God also has other stories going on with other peoples. The example of that, just to kind of make this concrete, is God gives the land, Natan, the land to Israel, but that God also gives the land of Edom to the Edomites, etc. That Deuteronomy, it seems important to the Deuteronomist to actually make that clear, right? That God's love for Israel is not exclusive. And also, Deuteronomy goes out of its way in really interesting ways to insist that God's love for Israel is not a function of Israel's merit. If anything, right, the book of Deuteronomy basically says,
clear.
You're not so fabulous, just to be clear, right? I love Moshe Weinfeld's formulation, right? The Deuteronomist is worried to repudiate a superiority complex, right? He wants to make sure that doesn't happen. So it's election by grace. It's election that doesn't make love exclusive, right? So, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we can say. I'll mention there's a comment, if I recall correctly, this is something that the Bible scholar Joel Kaminsky actually says in an old article. He says, you can't actually say, I'm going to let go of chosenness and then have the tradition go on functioning as a biblical tradition. So he gives the example. I hope I'm not making this up. This is what I remember. With apologies to Joel if I'm misremembering. You have people, for example, in a Reconstructionist congregation will go up to the Torah and edit the blessing so that it doesn't talk about the chosenness of Israel, but then go ahead and read the Torah, which is all about the chosenness of Israel. And so you kind of, it doesn't actually work. So I think we need to find more and more sophisticated ways of talking about chosenness rather than repudiating it. And the thing that I tried to show in the book is that, or one of the things I tried to show is that often thinkers who repudiate chosenness also caricature it first, right? Which is never a great sign. Like Kaplan's reading of chosenness in the Bible is not particularly rich because he's not able to muster any sympathy for it. And I actually just think if you're gonna, maybe especially if you're going to repudiate an idea, first give it the best reading it's capable of being given. I don't think that Kaplan meets that test. I don't think Walter Brueggemann in biblical studies meets that test. Brueggemann will say in one of his essays, in modern times, we're called upon to choose against chosenness. I understand where that impulse comes from, but I have to say, I feel like it's often coupled with a kind of reductive, caricatured reading of chosenness. I think you certainly find that in Kaplan.
Amen. For me, I think that's captures a lot. Just from a biblical perspective, I think Deuteronomy is a easy place to stop over, and you just read Deuteronomy 5, then 6, then 7 and 8, then 9. And it's like, okay, we get it, right? Chosen for a mission for the sake of all the families of the earth, right? Okay, so speaking of the chosen people of Israel, however that mechanism worked out, you prioritize what I think for a lot of people will feel very strange initially, which is that the love of neighbor is that you actually have an obligation to love one's own first and in a different way than others. So maybe you could quickly point out why that is not as horrible as it sounds. And for some people, it will sound horrible.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for that. And it actually will bring us back, I hope, to something we talked about a little bit earlier. So first, since we're focusing on biblical studies, let me just say, although I know that there are both traditional rabbis and some modern scholars who have tried to read Leviticus otherwise, I think that on a shot level, it's basically impossible to read Leviticus 19:18 as talking about anything other than fellow members of the covenant. You have the terms there, achicha, amitecha, right? Your brother, those terms are all covenantal. So when it then says love your neighbor as yourself, your neighbor is obviously there in the pshat, a fellow member of the covenant. Now, again, I understand why many readers have insisted it's universal, and I'm sympathetic to why they read it that way. But the biblical reader in me sort of says, yeah, but come on, right? That's not a great reading of the text. And so then my next step is, okay, so what might that teach us about Jewish ethics and about ethics more broadly, maybe more importantly? And what I try to argue is that Jewish ethics tries to work with the grain of nature rather than against it. And that means that, of course, you have to honor that human beings have particular loves, what philosophers call partial loves. Not partial in the sense of other than whole, but partial as in I'm partial towards you, partiality, right? Of course, human beings are partial in their love. That's part of what it means to be a human being. A human being who loves everyone in the world equally has lost part of what it means to be a human being, which is to have relationships. And part of what it means to have relationships is to be partial to some people. Now, the challenge then is to clarify that when you say love your neighbor, you don't mean love your neighbor and hate everyone else or love your neighbor and ignore everyone else. It means love your neighbor in an especially intense way. And also, as I quote sources saying, love every human being in the world because they're created in the image of God. And what that enables is what I call Judaism's particularist universalism, a universalism that works through the particular rather than pretending to bypass it. Now, I understand that there's an important challenge here, which is when you legitimate family first, you run the risk of devolving into family only. And for sure, that is a real concern that has to be wrestled with. But I don't think the alternative is to say, oh, well, I will love every human being in the whole world equally. Because A, I don't think that's possible. And B, I don't actually think it's desirable because it violates the very essence of what it actually means to be a person. So, that's very important. Now here, how does this bring us back to where we were earlier? Is that, Steve Pope then pointed out to me, oh, it's interesting. The Christians who tend to talk about loving every person in the world equally tend to be Lutherans, right? Kierkegaard. He's like, as a student of Aquinas agrees with you completely. The order of loves is essential. And Steve has written about this at great length, right? That there is an order of love. Of course, I love my daughter more than I love the kid across the street. Of course I do, as I should. And yet I also have responsibilities for that kid across the street. And that's the kind of move there that I think is essential. There's a funny meeting point, by the way. I'm sorry if this is a little obscure, but a funny meeting point between that Lutheran strand of loving everyone equally and a certain kind of radical utilitarianism that, argues the same thing. Kierkegaard meets Peter Singer in a very funny and strange way. And I just think that's not how human life works. A world in which I'm not allowed to love my child more than yours is a world in which I'm not allowed to be a person. And that can't possibly be right.
Yeah, I think I appreciated how you kind of embedded, you said you want to do a theological anthropology, but you're doing a lot of that work, especially in this section where you're talking about the individual body within the biological family body, right? That you're just born of somebody and have obligations to, and then how that extends out, which to me means that the whole project that you're actually getting into here is also epistemic in the sense of discerning love, that love has to be discerned carefully. And even when you talk about the neighbor versus the stranger versus the enemy, and when you get into enemy love, there's classically famous discussions in the New Testament, and I'm sure in the Mishnah as well. But who is an enemy, right? And who represents my enemy today? So I wonder, how do you parse those issues for just people trying to think through, what is the foreigner today, like in a modern context, and what is the enemy, and how do you, is this just my haters at work who don't want to see me get promoted, or is there something worse going on here, and how does that inform our view of love towards them?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I do think it's interesting to distinguish for a moment between love of the ger or stranger or sojourner on the one hand and the question of love of enemies on the other. You know, the hardest chapter in this book for me to write by a lot was around the question of love of enemies. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One of them was, this is one of the places where there's a kind of cultural truism that is very hard to overcome. The truism goes something like this: whereas Christianity says to love your enemy, Judaism says, and then fill in something else. Don't be naive, defend yourself, whatever it might be. And as often, or maybe always, when there are truisms like that, my first impulse is to sort of poke at them and sort of ask, is that really right? So I started doing some serious research that I'd never really done before on what love of enemies is taken to mean, both in New Testament scholarship and in later Christian ethics. And one of the things I found, which I found really interesting, was that although most, I guess, Christian ethicists, maybe almost all, would say that love of enemies lies at the heart of Jesus's teaching, they've never been able to really agree about what that actually requires. So I found myself kind of literally pulling out a pad and making a list of all of the different things I had seen either New Testament scholars or Christian ethicists say that love of enemies requires. And I looked at this list and I thought to myself, well, that's interesting, because most of the items on this list are amply attested in the Hebrew Bible or in rabbinic sources as well. So, just take an example, the ethos of non-retaliation, right? Jews say traditionally, Jews who pray the traditional liturgy 3 times a day, we utter a prayer, to those who curse me, may my soul remain silent. And the rabbis sort of valorize those who are capable of absorbing an insult without feeling the need to utter an insult in return, right? The ethos of non-retaliation. The refusal of schadenfreude, which is amply expressed in the book of Proverbs already, for example. So I found that sort of really interesting, right? Love of enemies, as it's often understood by many Christian scholars, you have that in a lot of in a lot of traditional Jewish sources, biblical and rabbinic. Where I think this gets messy, and you kind of alluded to this in the question, and I actually wish I had made this point more emphatically in the book, actually, now that I, think about it, is that a lot of our discourse about enemies, I think, suffers from our not stopping to clarify who and what we're talking about, right? The word enemy can mean so many different things. I mean, as you alluded to, it can mean, the guy at work I don't get along with. It can refer to a person I was in business with, but I had questions about their ethics, and now we haven't spoken in a long time, right? And it can refer to Saddam Hussein, right? It's not clear to me from a Jewish perspective that what applies to the first two applies in every instance to the third. I think in those first 2 instances, the overwhelming Jewish impulse is to say, yeah, those enemies you have to love. That's like the donkey driver in the book of Deuteronomy, right? You see your enemies, right? Of course you're obligated. That enemy is still your neighbor, you might say, right? Where I think there might be some daylight between, I don't know, let's say most Christian teachers and most Jewish ones is regarding the Saddam Husseins of the world, right? I don't know that most Jewish ethicists would say, yeah, there's an obligation to love Saddam Hussein. And
we should explain for the listeners that Saddam Hussein was the former dictator of Iraq who's convicted of war crimes and executed. Because now we do now have people in their 30s who are just like, I kind of remember who Saddam Hussein is. It's like saying Idi Amin or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and a truly almost unspeakably awful human being. Right. And that's really the point, and so it's interesting. And I'll say that this is, really kind of getting into the weeds of my own writing process. I had been very influenced by a 20th century ultra-Orthodox writer named Yechezkel Levinstein, who says, hatred is always a vice, always and in every circumstance. Anytime you see a biblical or rabbinic source that seems to legitimate hate, you're reading it wrong. It can never mean that. And that's kind of where I was for a long time. And then I started reading a few contemporary philosophers, not Jewish ones and not Christian ones, just moral philosophers, who argued something that really kind of took me aback. And I'm still honestly, several years later, still thinking this through for myself. It basically said, why is that always the assumption? Is targeted hate not a possibility? Is it really true that if I hate Vladimir Putin, it's going to spill over into my relationship with my children? Is that right? Why would you say that? Now, I think we could go back and forth on this. We could invite psychologists into the room. We could talk this through. But I'll say that's where the question gets really hard for me. Is there a mitzvah, if you will, to love Vladimir Putin? I'm not sure that Jewish sources think that. Whereas I think probably, I recently said to a prominent Christian theologian, just want to be clear, you think that there is the Christian ideal is that you should feel love and act lovingly towards Vladimir Putin. And she said, yes, absolutely. It's very hard, but I do think that is what the gospel asks of me. And I say, that's interesting because that's a place where I think there might be some daylight between the two traditions.
And I think that daylight, and again, that would vary by theologian, right? So I in the sense that neither of us can speak for Judaism and Christianity,
right?
In
Of
toto,
course,
right? But I thought that was an interesting part of the book where you really do think about, well, what would it mean to treat Vladimir Putin lovingly? Would that mean locking him in a room and never letting him get out or have access to nuclear weapons, or this whole question of, well, what does loving treatment actually look like, and how do you attenuate that per circumstance? Which I think you dealt with pretty well at length.
So, Dru, if it's okay with you, I would love to share an experience that I had just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, please.
That touched me very deeply. I've been really moved by, as I've traveled the country talking about this book, and more importantly, the ideas of the book, the things people have shared with me either during events or afterwards. And recently, I did a kind of public dialogue with a local rabbi. And afterwards, an elderly lady came up to me and said, in a way that I found really kind of, in the moment, kind of overwhelming, she said, I have a question for you. My husband beat the daylights out of my kids and me for years. I'm curious what you think the Torah thinks my attitude towards him should be. Right? And you have this moment where you're like, okay, now we're not BSing anymore, right? Now we're really talking about where God's word meets the reality of human suffering, right? In some really deep way, and it's a very humbling experience, of course, right? And, I said to her, I said to her what I think is always important to say first. I said, I am so, so sorry, right? First thing to say, right? And the second thing I said, which I'm still not completely convinced was an adequate answer, but it kind of gets, I think, at what you just started saying, which is why I was moved to share it. I said to her, I don't know if there's a mitzvah for you to love your ex-husband, but I do want to say that if there is, maybe praying that before he dies, he realized the enormity of what he did and repent is the greatest act of love that you could show him. We should just be clear that when we talk about a loving posture of someone, that doesn't mean taking them out for breakfast necessarily. It doesn't mean sending them flowers. It might just mean hoping that their soul somehow is redeemed. It might, right? So I found that to be just, her asking me that was so disarming. I mean that in a deep sense, disarming. I didn't know what to say. That was sort of my suggestion. And it really goes, what you said is what reminded me of that, because, right, what does it mean to love Vladimir Putin? Maybe it just means, God, I hope his soul, right, somehow understands the gravity of what it's done in this world. That's not nothing.
Which in some ways is really putting a very deep-seated trust in the ability of God to account for people who can turn from their wrongs, right? This physical turning and saying, I was doing this thing and I now see it's wrong, and coming back lifnei, right, before God in some way. Yeah, I think most of us would be stuck at that moment to think okay, speak very carefully. I've had these interactions with people, and man, that's a tough one. You navigated that one well. I give you an A+.
Yeah, I mean that wasn't the point of the story, but thank you.
I want to study under Shai Held's school of rabbinic of handling difficult situations. I do have one last question. I actually have a lot more questions for you, but I'm only going to ask one because we're running out of time here. And that is, I'm just wondering, just curiosity, I'm a podcaster. you've done a lot of interviews and podcasts for this book. You published it with a publisher I'm very jealous of, because I always think those are the coolest books that come out of that publishing house. I'm wondering what you think is like one of the best questions you've ever been asked in one of these, like a question where you're like, oh, wow, that is a really, really good question. Like I wanted to ask you what was the worst question, but Better Angels took over.
I don't know if this is the best question, but I will tell you the question that I found myself fumphing around the most, surprisingly, is that a rabbi in Atlanta in a dialogue said to me, every really good book belongs distinctively and exclusively to its author. So what makes this book distinctively and exclusively Shai Held's book? And I was like, wow. First of all, it's a really interesting premise. And second of all, it's a really hard question. I don't really know what to say. That's not the most intellectually interesting question about the content. It was the most interesting question about the process of producing a book.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, what I ended up talking about, and not that this is exclusively Shai Held's
wait,
book,
I have just one final question before we get into that is, so every good book belongs, exclusively to its author. So I'm wondering what makes Judaism is about love exclusively belong and extend from Shai Held.
By the way, Drew, do you agree that it's a really good question?
I do think I mean I ask similar questions kind of like sometimes, and I didn't do it with you, but I often ask, how did you get here? Like, how did you get to the point where you spent so many hours writing and then rewriting that stuff?
Right. Well, that question I felt I could answer, right? Because I even start out the book beginning to talk about that. The question, for whatever it's worth, I mean, it's really not even that interesting. The answer that I gave him was something about the aspiration to read classical sources really deeply in an emotionally present way. And that's sort of like, that's what I want my classroom to be about. And I wanted to see if I could really fully carry that over into a page so that I could have that interaction with my reader, even if I'm not in the room and, may never talk to that person. In terms of questions about content, I mean, the question that elderly woman asked me is up there.
Right.
Is really up there. People, this is, maybe you'll edit this out after I say it. People have asked me some really hard questions about whether there are any parts of this book I would write differently in the wake of October 7th. That's been a really hard question to think about.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure I know what the answer is.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, Shai Held, thank you so much for this book. And the goal you said twice now, I've heard you say, to write emotionally present thinking that engages the audience also into kind of a rigorous scholarly way of thinking through things, but in a readable tone. I think you've been remarkably successful. The book is Judaism is about love, recovering the heart of Jewish life. And again, I think for Christians, you will find this an eminently accessible text into some of the riches of Jewish thought and just some of the riches of Shai Held's thinking as well. Shai, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Drew.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.